In the vast, unforgiving silence, where the sun bakes the earth into a fractured mosaic of ochre and dust, a life was coming to an end. This was a land of harsh truths, where the cycle of life and death spun with a brutal, unsentimental rhythm. Here, nestled in the shadow of a skeletal acacia tree, was a creature that should have embodied the wild's perfect, lethal grace. Instead, it was a portrait of heartbreaking ruin. A leopard cub, no older than a few months, lay curled into a tight knot of fading warmth. His coat, which should have been a constellation of black rosettes on a field of gold, was matted with grime and blood. One leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, a cruel testament to the trap that had likely stolen his mother and left him to this slow, lonely fate. His breath was a shallow, ragged whisper against the immense indifference of the landscape. This was not a place for mercy. It was an anvil upon which the strong were forged and the weak were broken. And this small, trembling life was irrevocably, tragically broken. The world had abandoned him. His instincts screamed for a mother who would never return. His body cried out for nourishment that was nowhere to be found. And his spirit, the fiery essence of a predator, was being extinguished like a candle in a storm. He was a ghost in waiting, a final, silent heartbeat away from being reclaimed by the earth. This was the scene of utter despair that met the eyes of Alex and Ben, a young couple whose journey into this remote wilderness was meant to be one of discovery, not of impossible choices. They had come seeking the soul of the wild, but they had not expected to find it so fragile, so close to being snuffed out. Ben, his face a mask of pragmatic pity, saw only the inevitable. He saw a dying animal, a link in the food chain that was about to break. To interfere, his mind argued, was to disrupt a natural, albeit cruel, order. It was dangerous. It was foolish. What could they possibly do? But Alex saw something else entirely. Her gaze, filled with a profound and almost painful empathy, looked past the dirt, the injury, the dying embers of a wild thing. In the cub's clouded, terrified eyes, she saw not an animal, but a soul, a being trapped in a vortex of pain and loneliness. For her, this was not a choice. It was a mandate, a silent, desperate plea that echoed in a place deeper than reason. A quiet, fierce resolve settled over her. She would not, could not, let this story end here. Against Ben's voiced concerns, against the cold logic of the wilderness itself, she moved forward. The crisis was absolute. The stakes were life and death. And in that moment, a savior, defined not by power, but by an unwavering compassion, knelt in the dust and made a promise to a creature on the very brink of oblivion. The journey back was a blur of tense silence, the only sound the pained, shallow breaths from the bundle wrapped in Alex's jacket. Every jolt of their vehicle felt like a new wave of agony inflicted upon the tiny body. Ben drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his mind racing with a litany of rational fears. Vets, authorities, diseases, the sheer untamable nature of what lay sleeping a fitful, feverish sleep in his partner's arms. This was madness. Yet every time he glanced at Alex, he saw a look of such serene, unshakable purpose that his arguments died in his throat. She was already in a different world, a world where the only thing that mattered was the flickering life she cradled. Back at their remote research outpost, a place of books and scientific equipment, the first night became a crucible. They had no access to a proper wildlife veterinarian for hundreds of miles. They were on their own. With trembling hands, they cleaned the cub's wounds as best they could, the animal too weak to even flinch. Alex fashioned a rudimentary splint for the broken leg, her movements gentle, her voice a constant, soothing murmur. She dripped water and a mixture of milk, replacer they miraculously had for another project onto his tongue, a drop at a time, for hours. Ben the skeptic found himself becoming an unwilling accomplice, holding a light, boiling water, his pragmatism slowly eroded by the sheer force of Alex's will. He watched her, and he watched the cub, a creature he now thought of as Kale, a name Alex had whispered into its fur. The night was long and filled with a heavy, prayerful silence. Would he survive? Could he survive? It seemed impossible. He was a spark against a hurricane, As dawn broke, casting long, cool shadows across the floor, Ben found Alex asleep in a chair, her hand resting near the box where Cale lay. He peered inside, expecting the worst, and his breath caught in his chest. The cub's eyes were open. They were still clouded with fear and pain, but they were open. He was watching Alex. He had survived the night. The first battle was won, but Ben knew, with a chilling certainty, that the war for this creature's soul had only just begun. The first light of dawn did not bring with it a sense of relief, but rather the heavy weight of a new reality. Cale had survived the night, a small miracle in itself, but he had woken up to a world of terrifying strangeness. The familiar scents of earth and acacia were gone, replaced by the sterile smell of antiseptic and the alien scent of humans. He was no longer under the vast open sky, but confined within a structure of straight lines and hard surfaces. Fear, a primal and all-consuming force, was now his entire existence. Every sound, a footstep on the wooden floor, the click of a door, a human voice, was a thunderclap of terror that sent jolts through his frail body. He would press himself into the corner of his makeshift den, a large crate Alex had lined with soft blankets, trying to make himself so small he might simply disappear. His world had shrunk to this box, and the universe outside it was populated by giants whose intentions were a terrifying mystery. Alex understood this. She felt his terror as if it were her own. She knew that the physical healing was only one part of the equation. The deeper, more profound wound was to his spirit. Trust, she knew, could not be demanded. It had to be earned painstakingly, one silent moment at a time. And so began the slow, arduous process that would come to define their days. Alex's life reoriented itself around the terrified creature in the crate. She would spend hours just sitting on the floor of the room, a considerable distance away, with a book in her lap. She never stared at him directly, knowing that a predator's gaze was a threat. She would simply exist in his space, a calm, non-threatening presence. She spoke to him in a low, continuous murmur, not with words that he could understand, but with a tone that she hoped would, over time, become a kind of soothing music, a counter-frequency to the static of his fear. Ben watched this ritual with a mixture of awe and deep-seated anxiety. His rational mind screamed that this was a wild animal, a future apex predator. He would pace outside the room, a constant worrier. Alex, what happens when he gets bigger? When his instincts kick in? This isn't a kitten, he would say, his voice laced with genuine concern for her safety. He was the voice of reason, the anchor to a reality that Alex seemed willing to transcend. He saw the future, a full-grown leopard in their home, and it was a future fraught with unimaginable complications and danger. He loved Alex, and his fear for her was a palpable thing. But Alex was resolute. "He's not just an animal, Ben," she would reply softly, her eyes never leaving the room where Cale was hidden. "He's a life. And right now he's just a terrified baby who has lost everything." Her patience was a force of nature in itself, a quiet, unyielding river of compassion. The first offering of food was a monumental test. Alex placed a small bowl of minced meat and milk replacer just inside the room, then retreated. For hours, Cale did not move. He watched the bowl, his small body rigid with suspicion. Hunger gnawed at him, a desperate, physical need. But fear was a more powerful master. The scent was tantalizing, a promise of life, but it was associated with the giants, with the unknown. Ben, watching from the doorway, sighed. He's not going to take it. He's too wild. But Alex simply waited. As dusk fell, and the room filled with shadows, Cale finally, tentatively, crept from his box. Each step was a masterpiece of silent caution. He approached the bowl as if it were a venomous snake, his nose twitching, his ears swiveling to catch the slightest sound. He snatched a single piece of meat and darted back into the safety of his den, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was a tiny victory, almost imperceptible, but for Alex it was everything. It was the first crack in the wall of his terror. It was the first sign that the instinct to live might, just might, be strong enough to overcome the instinct to fear. The days that followed blurred into a routine of painstaking patience. Kale's physical health improved steadily. The splint on his leg held, and he began to put a little weight on it. His coat, with regular, distant cleaning from Alex using a cloth on a long pole, began to shed its grime, revealing the faint, beautiful rosettes beneath. He was a stunning creature, a perfect piece of natural art, but his spirit remained in its cage of fear. Alex continued her silent vigils, her quiet monologues, her patient offerings of food. Each day, she would move the bowl an inch closer to where she sat. It was a glacial progression, a geological shifting of boundaries measured in millimeters. For weeks, this was the entirety of their interaction, a silent contract negotiated across a shrinking space. Kale would watch her from the shadows of his crate, his golden eyes two luminous points of intense, unblinking scrutiny. The narrator could only imagine his internal world. A maelstrom of conflicting instincts. The ingrained, genetic memory of his species screamed that the human was danger, an enemy, the apex predator that hunted his kind. But a newer, fainter voice was beginning to emerge. This human was strange. It did not shout. It did not make sudden moves. It brought food, the giver of life. It filled the air with a soft, rhythmic sound that was, against all logic, becoming less terrifying and more calming. He began to associate her presence with sustenance and a peculiar sense of peace. Ben's skepticism began to fray at the edges. He saw the slow, almost imperceptible changes. He saw the way Kale would now watch Alex, not with pure terror, but with a kind of intense, searching curiosity. He saw the way Alex seemed to understand the cub's needs on an almost telepathic level. One afternoon, Ben found Alex sitting on the floor, and Kale was not in his crate, but lying just at its entrance, watching her. He hadn't retreated. "He's been like this for an hour," Alex whispered, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. It was a breakthrough, a silent acknowledgement that her presence was no longer a trigger for immediate flight. The rational part of Ben's mind was still wary, but another part of him, the part that loved Alex, felt a burgeoning sense of awe. He was witnessing a dialogue without words, a connection being woven thread by patient thread. It was a process so slow, so delicate, it was like watching a flower bloom in time-lapse. He started to see what Alex saw, not a dangerous beast, but a wounded soul learning to navigate a new, bewildering world. The daily rituals became more intricate, more layered with unspoken meaning. Alex began to introduce new elements into their shared space, testing the boundaries of Kale's burgeoning curiosity. One day, she brought in a small, soft blue blanket. It held her scent, a scent Kale was now beginning to associate not with fear, but with the arrival of food and the strange, quiet peace of her vigils. She didn't offer it to him directly. She simply placed it on the floor, halfway between her and his crate, and left it there. For 2 days, Kale ignored it, circling it with suspicion on his rare forays for food. It was another alien object in his alien world. But on the third morning, when Alex entered the room, she saw that the blanket had been moved. It was just inside the entrance to his crate. He hadn't taken it all the way in, but he had touched it, investigated it, claimed it in some small way. The next day it was gone. Peeking carefully, Alex could see a corner of blue fabric nestled in the back of the crate, where Kale was curled up, his small body rising and falling in a steady rhythm of sleep. He had accepted her offering. He was sleeping on her scent. It was a profound act of trust, a symbol of a bridge being built between two vastly different worlds. This was the moment that Ben's remaining walls of skepticism truly began to crumble. He had seen the blanket, had heard Alex's hopeful explanation, and had dismissed it as wishful thinking. But seeing the proof with his own eyes, the wild leopard cub voluntarily wrapping himself in a human-scented object, was something that defied his logical understanding of the world. He started to spend more time just watching, no longer as a concerned critic, but as a student of this unbelievable process. He saw how Kale's fear had begun to be eclipsed by an almost cat-like curiosity. The cub's head would now poke out of the crate whenever Alex entered, his ears perked, his eyes bright with inquiry rather than terror. He would follow her movements with an intense focus, a silent participant in her world. The slow burn of trust was igniting into a steady, warm flame. Alex, sensing this critical shift, knew that the time was coming for a greater leap of faith. The distance between them had shrunk, but there was still an invisible barrier, a line of untouchability that had not yet been crossed. She felt, with that deep intuition that had guided her from the very beginning, that Cale might be ready. The fear was still there, a ghost in his eyes, but it was now mingled with something else, a yearning for connection, a loneliness that resonated with her own deep empathy. She decided that the next move had to be a radical one, a gesture of complete vulnerability that would either shatter the fragile peace they had built or solidify it into something unbreakable. The plan was simple, and to Ben, utterly terrifying. She would not try to touch Cale. She would invite him to touch her. She would lie down on the floor, surrendering her height, her authority, her status as a giant, and she would wait. It was a gamble of immense proportions, a bet placed on the unproven possibility that compassion could truly conquer instinct. The day came when the air itself felt different, charged with a quiet anticipation. Cale had been bolder than ever, venturing almost halfway across the room to retrieve his food. His movements losing some of their spidery caution and gaining a youthful, fluid grace. His leg had healed remarkably, and he was beginning to look less like a victim and more like the magnificent creature he was born to be. Alex took a deep breath, a silent prayer on her lips, and entered the room. Ben stood at the doorway, a silent, anxious sentinel. He had argued against this, pleaded with her to be careful, but he also knew that her connection with Cale operated on a plane he couldn't fully comprehend. He could only watch and hope. Alex didn't bring food. She brought only herself. She slowly, deliberately, lay down on her side on the cool wooden floor, her back partially to Cale's crate. She rested her head on her arm and closed her eyes, feigning sleep. She made herself as small, as non-threatening, as vulnerable as a human can be. And then she waited. Silence descended upon the room, thick and heavy. Minutes stretched into an eternity. From the corner of his eye, Ben could see Cale at the entrance of his crate, a statue of tawny gold and black spots. He was watching. His entire being was focused on the still form of the human on the floor. What was going through his mind? Was it confusion? Suspicion? Was the ancient predator instinct seeing an opportunity? Or was the newly forged trust seeing an invitation? An hour passed. Ben's legs ached from standing, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Alex did not move a muscle. She was a picture of absolute faith. Then it happened. A movement so slow, so tentative, it was barely perceptible. Cale slid from his crate, his belly low to the ground, a silent, fluid shadow. He placed one paw, then another, onto the floor, his claws retracted. He moved not with the stalking gait of a hunter, but with the cautious, questioning steps of a pilgrim approaching a sacred shrine. He crossed the floor, the space that had for so long represented an unassailable chasm between their worlds. He stopped a foot from Alex's outstretched hand. He stood there for what felt like a lifetime, his nose twitching, taking in her scent, reading the air for any sign of deception. He could hear the soft, steady rhythm of her breathing. He could feel the calm energy she radiated. Ben held his breath, a sob catching in his throat. This was it, the moment of truth. Cale took one more step. He lowered his magnificent head, the patterns on his for a mesmerizing dance of light and shadow. He extended his neck, slowly, so slowly, and then, with an impossible heart-stopping gentleness, he nudged his wet nose against the tips of Alex's fingers. It was not a bite, not a threat. It was a question, an acceptance, a greeting. It was a conscious choice. In that single miraculous point of contact, the wall between them didn't just crack. It dissolved into dust. Alex opened her eyes, and they were filled with tears. She didn't move. She just let him be, let him feel the warmth of her skin. Cale kept his nose there for a long moment. Then he emitted a sound that Ben had never heard before, a low, guttural, vibrating rumble. It was a purr. The sound of contentment. The sound of a wild heart choosing to trust. It was the breakthrough, the miracle they had been praying for, a moment so profound it seemed to rewrite the very laws of nature. The aftermath of the breakthrough was like the world shifting from black and white to vibrant color. The invisible barrier was gone, and in its place grew a connection of astonishing depth and beauty. Kale, the once terrified phantom who lived in the shadows of a crate, blossomed. The tentative touch had opened a floodgate of affection and trust. He would now initiate contact, rubbing his head against Alex's legs, his powerful purr a constant, rumbling presence in their small home. He would nap not in his crate, but on the blue blanket placed near Alex's desk as she worked. He would even allow Ben, the former skeptic, to gently stroke his back, a concession that left Ben speechless with a sense of reverent awe. Kale began to play, his movements an incredible display of youthful energy and predatory grace. He would chase a rolled-up sock with the same focused intensity his wild brethren would use on prey, pouncing and batting at it before looking to Alex for approval. He was, in so many ways, becoming like a house cat, albeit a very large, very powerful one. Their little outpost, once a place of tense silence, was now filled with a unique and joyful harmony. It was a fragile paradise, a secret world they had built on a foundation of impossible love. But paradise is often fleeting. The world outside their sanctuary, the world of rules and regulations and human fear, was about to intrude in the most brutal way. Their outpost was remote, but not entirely isolated. A supply driver, making a rare delivery, caught a fleeting glimpse of a large, spotted cat through a window. He saw not a miracle of interspecies trust, but a terrifying predator in a human home. The fear, amplified by gossip and misunderstanding, traveled faster than they could have ever imagined. Within a week, a dusty official vehicle rumbled up their path, and a man in a crisp uniform stepped out. He was a wildlife official, a man named Peters, whose face was etched with the grim seriousness of his job. He represented the rational world, the world of liability and law. His presence was an immediate and chilling threat to their existence. Peters was not unkind, but he was firm. He listened to their story, to Alex's passionate, tearful plea and Ben's now fierce, articulate defense of Kale. But he looked at them with the eyes of a man who had seen too many well-intentioned people get mauled, too many wild animals become dangerous and unpredictable. "I understand what you believe you've done here," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "But you are harboring a Class 1 predator. This is illegal, and it is incredibly dangerous. The animal must be confiscated." The word confiscated struck them like a physical blow. Alex felt the world tilting on its axis. "Confiscated to where?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Peters's expression was grim. Given his level of human habituation, he can never be released into the wild. He would be a danger to himself and to people. He'll be taken to a secure facility. They knew what facility meant. It was a euphemism for a life in a concrete cage, a sterile, lonely existence that would be a prison for his body and a death sentence for his spirit. Or worse. The unspoken alternative hung heavy in the air. "He's not dangerous," Ben argued, his voice rising with a passion that surprised even himself. "He's gentle. He's family." Peters shook his head, unmoved. "He is a leopard. His instincts are genetics. Sooner or later, they will take over. I've seen it 100 times. I am giving you 48 hours to prepare. We will be back on Friday to transport the animal." And with that he turned and left, leaving a cloud of dust and shattered hopes in his wake. The peace was broken. The external world, with its cold, hard logic, had breached their walls. Their impossible love was now pitted against the immovable object of human law and fear. The joy of the past few weeks evaporated, replaced by a suffocating dread. They had healed Kale's body and his soul, only to have him condemned to a life that was arguably worse than the death he had originally faced. The official's decree was a death knell, echoing through the once peaceful rooms of their home. The 48-hour deadline loomed over them like a guillotine. A frantic, desperate energy replaced the calm harmony they had so carefully cultivated. Alex was a ghost of herself, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, her movements listless. She would sit with Cale, burying her face in his fur, whispering promises she no longer knew if she could keep. Cale, with a profound sensitivity he had developed, seemed to understand her distress. He would nudge her with his head, his low purr a constant, rumbling question. He would rest a heavy paw on her lap, a gesture of comfort that only deepened her anguish. How could anyone see this creature, so attuned to her emotions, so gentle in his strength, and call him a monster? The most remarkable transformation, however, was in Ben. The man who had once been the voice of caution, the rational skeptic who worried about the untamable wild, was now a roaring lion in Cale's defense. The threat of losing Cale had galvanized him, cementing a bond he hadn't even fully realized he'd formed. His skepticism had not been erased. It had been conquered by the undeniable truth of what he had witnessed every single day. Love and patience had rewired a wild animal's brain, and he would not let the ignorant world tear their family apart. He spent hours on the satellite phone, calling every wildlife expert, every sanctuary, every legal aid organization he could find. He pored over obscure wildlife regulations, searching for a loophole, a precedent, anything that could save them. His scientific, methodical mind, once used to argue against keeping Cale, was now his most powerful weapon in the fight to protect him. "There has to be a way, Alex," he would say, his voice tight with determination. "They can't just do this. They can't punish him for being a survivor." The internal struggle was immense. They were pitted against a faceless bureaucracy, a system designed to see animals as categories and statistics, not as individuals with complex emotional lives. Their personal experience, as profound and miraculous as it was, felt like a whisper against a hurricane of rules and public safety concerns. Every argument Ben made over the phone was met with the same cold, unassailable logic. A leopard is not a pet. But Cale wasn't a pet. He was something more, something for which their language had no word. He was a bridge between two worlds, and the authorities wanted to blow that bridge up. As the final day dawned, a heavy sense of impending doom settled over the house. Ben had managed to do one thing. He had convinced Peters to return not with a transportation cage, but with an open mind. It was a long shot, a desperate plea to the man's humanity. Peters had reluctantly agreed to one final observation, one last chance for them to prove their case, though his tone suggested it was a mere formality. The plan was non-existent. How do you demonstrate a soul? How do you prove love? They could only hope that Cale himself, in his own unknowable way, could communicate the truth of his nature. Their future, Cale's future, now rested on a single fragile and utterly unpredictable encounter. It was a final, desperate stand for their impossible family. The air was thick with a silent, unbearable tension when Peters's vehicle appeared again on the horizon. This was it, the final judgment. Ben met him at the door, his face pale but resolute. "Thank you for coming back, for giving us this chance," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Peters gave a curt nod, his expression unreadable. "Let's get this over with," he said, stepping inside. Alex was sitting on the floor in the main room, just as she had done in those first, terrifying weeks. But this time, Cale was not hiding in a crate. He was lying beside her, his magnificent body relaxed, his head resting on her lap. He watched the stranger enter, his golden eyes sharp and intelligent, but he did not move. There was no growl, no hiss, no sign of aggression, just a calm, watchful stillness. Peters stood frozen for a moment, his professional composure visibly rattled by the scene. He had expected a caged, snarling animal. He was confronted with a scene of profound domesticity that defied everything his training had taught him. "He seems calm," Peters admitted, his voice a little less certain than before. "He is calm," Alex said softly. "He is home." For the next hour, they simply talked. Ben and Alex recounted the entire story, from the moment they found him near death to the breakthrough of the first touch. They spoke of his gentleness, his intelligence, his clear emotional bond with them. Peters listened, his gaze shifting from the couple to the leopard, who remained placid and serene by Alex's side. He was still a skeptic, his mind searching for the flaw, the inevitable trigger that would reveal the true wild animal beneath. And then the moment came. The emotional strain of the past 2 days, the fear of losing Kale, finally overwhelmed Alex. Her voice broke, and a silent tear rolled down her cheek. Then another. A soft, choked sob escaped her lips. She tried to stifle it, not wanting to show weakness, not wanting to do anything that might spook Kale. But it was too late. Kale felt the shift instantly. Her body tensed. Her scent changed. The rhythm of her breathing faltered. He lifted his massive head from her lap, his ears perked. He looked at her face, his gaze intense and focused. What happened next left both Ben and Peters utterly breathless. It was a moment that would be forever seared into their memories. Kale, the apex predator, the creature of instinct, did something that no textbook or wildlife manual could ever explain. He leaned forward and gently, so gently, nudged his cheek against hers, just as he had done with her hand all those months ago. Then he began to lick away her tears, his rough tongue a surprisingly soft comfort against her skin. He let out a low, rumbling purr, a sound not of simple contentment, but of active, deliberate soothing. He was comforting her. There was no other word for it. It was a conscious act of empathy, a display of cross-species compassion so clear, so undeniable, that it shattered every preconception in the room. Peters stood as if turned to stone. His mouth was slightly agape, his eyes wide with disbelief. He was a man of science and rules, of predictable animal behavior. What he was witnessing did not compute. It was not instinct. It was not habituation. It was love. He had come to confiscate a dangerous animal, and he had found a family. The silence in the room was profound, broken only by Alex's quiet sniffles and Kale's deep, reassuring purr. After a long moment, Peters finally spoke, his voice hoarse with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. I have never seen anything like that," he whispered. He looked from the leopard to the couple, and for the first time, he saw them not as reckless idealists, but as custodians of a miracle. The skeptic, the ultimate voice of rational authority, had been won over not by arguments or legal loopholes, but by a simple, powerful act of love. He cleared his throat, his official demeanor returning, but softened, changed. "I'm going to have to file a very creative report," he said, a faint smile touching his lips. "There will be conditions. Strict ones. Enclosures, regular checks. But he stays." The years that followed were a testament to the promise of that day. The story of Alex, Ben, and Kale became a quiet legend, a life lived on the fringes of what the world considered possible. The strict conditions laid down by Peters were met and exceeded. Ben, with his engineering mind, designed and built a sprawling outdoor enclosure that was a marvel of safety and enrichment, a slice of the wild brought to their doorstep. It had rocks to climb, pools to splash in, and trees that offered shade from the hot sun. Kale had the freedom to be a leopard, to leap and stalk and feel the earth beneath his paws. But more often than not, he chose to be where they were. His bond with Alex and Ben had not faded with time or maturity. It had deepened into something akin to an old, comfortable marriage. He was now a magnificent adult, a symphony of muscle and grace, his coat a flawless tapestry of black and gold. The frail, broken cub was a distant memory, replaced by a creature of breathtaking power and majesty. And yet, in his heart, he thought he was a house cat. His house just happened to include a few acres of secured wilderness. His favorite napping spot was a specially reinforced sofa on their veranda, where he would sprawl in the afternoon sun, one massive paw dangling over the edge, twitching as he dreamed. He would greet Alex every morning with a head but so forceful it could knock a less prepared person over, a gesture of pure, unadulterated affection. He even had a favorite toy, a heavy-duty buoy on a thick rope that Ben had hung from a tree, which he would bat and wrestle with for hours. But the most profound displays of his unique nature were the quiet moments. He would sit with Alex as she read, his body a warm, heavy presence against her, his rumbling purr a sound that could vibrate through the very floorboards. He would follow Ben around the enclosure as he did his daily checks, a silent, golden shadow at his heels. He was not a pet. The word was too small, too transactional for what he was. He was not a wild animal in the traditional sense, either. He was a third thing, a being forged in a crucible of trauma and love, existing in a space between two worlds. He was family. The rational world, in the form of Peter's, had not abandoned them. The official became an infrequent but welcome visitor, his visits slowly transforming from formal inspections into something resembling a friendly check-in. He would watch Cale interact with Alex and Ben, a look of perpetual awe on his face. He once confessed that their story had fundamentally changed the way he viewed his work, forcing him to see the individual soul behind the species label. Their life was a quiet, isolated one, a self-imposed exile to protect the peace they had fought so hard to win. They were custodians of a miracle, and it was a responsibility they bore with grace and unending love. The image was always the most striking at dusk, a man, a woman, and a full-grown leopard sitting together on a porch, watching the sun set over the vast, wild lands from which he had come, a perfect, impossible portrait of a family that never should have been, but somehow was. What, then, is the ultimate lesson of this story? What can we take away from the tale of Cale, the leopard who learned to love? It is a story that transcends the simple narrative of an animal rescue. It is a profound meditation on the very nature of life, love, and connection. It challenges our most fundamental assumptions about the boundaries that separate us, the line between human and animal, between wild and tame, between instinct and conscious choice. Was Cale's transformation simply a case of sophisticated conditioning, a wild creature habituated to its captors? To believe that is to dismiss the undeniable evidence of something far more profound. It is to ignore the moment he chose to comfort Alex's tears, an act not of instinct, but of empathy. It is to ignore the daily, quiet affirmations of a bond that went beyond mere dependency. The story of Cale is a testament to the immense, transformative power of patience and compassion. In a world that moves at a frantic pace, that demands instant results and discards what is broken, Alex's unwavering, quiet dedication stands as a powerful counter-narrative. She did not seek to tame Cale, to break his spirit. She sought only to heal it. She offered him the one thing his traumatic world had stolen, a sense of safety. She built a bridge of trust, not with force, but with vulnerability, and in doing so, she allowed him to walk across it on his own terms. And, in healing him, Cale, in turn, healed them. He taught Ben to look beyond the cold data of the rational world and see the soul that animates all living things. He taught Alex that her deep, seemingly impractical empathy was not a weakness, but a superpower capable of rewriting the laws of nature. He taught them both that a family is not defined by blood or species, but by the bonds of love and mutual care. This is a story about the plasticity of the heart, both human and animal. Cale was born of the wild, a creature genetically programmed for solitude and predation. But trauma wiped his slate clean, and love wrote a new story upon it. He reminds us that our past does not have to be our prison, that even the deepest wounds can be healed by a love that is patient enough to wait for the scars to fade. He became a living paradox, a creature of immense power who chose gentleness, a solitary hunter who craved companionship, a wild spirit who found his truest freedom not in the vast savanna, but in the sanctuary of a loving home. The story of the leopard who thinks he's a house cat is not really about a leopard at all. It is a mirror reflecting our own potential. It asks us, how much patience are we willing to give? How much love are we willing to offer to the wounded souls in our own lives, whatever species they may be? It suggests that the greatest miracles are not loud and sudden, but quiet, slow, and earned through the steady, daily practice of compassion. It is a timeless, awe-inspiring reminder that love is the most powerful force in the universe, a universal language that can bridge any divide, heal any wound, and create a family in the most unlikely of places.